There are multiple ways to keep in touch with the Wolf Connection podcast. Through our Instagram handle, the Wolf Connection Pod. And for comments and questions, send us an email to podcast@wolfconnection.org with your comments, questions, and guest ideas for Stephen and myself. You may hear your question answered on an upcoming podcast. Thank you for your support, and howls to you all. Welcome to the Wolf Connection podcast. I'm your host, John Kalfa. Let's talk about some moles. From my old stomping grounds in college anyway, this professor of natural resources and the environment at Cornell University for 30 years. He joins us there. This is Bernd Blossey. It's such a pleasure to have you, sir. He's also the director of the ecology. He's the director of the Ecology and Management of Invasive Plants program. Tongue twister there. So thank you for joining us. Thanks for taking out the time. How are you doing up there?
I'm doing wonderful. I'm expecting rain, which we badly need. You may share that. I assume you're sitting in California, but we have a lovely time, lovely summer for us so far. So I am enjoying it.
Oh, that's awesome. I want everybody to get an idea of your background because you were born in Germany, came over here in 1992. What was your life like growing up in Germany, and what eventually prompted you to move here to the States and become a professor?
Well, I grew up in northern Germany, basically between two coasts. There's a little peninsula, it's called Schleswig-Holstein, that ends up in Denmark. So when you think about the checkered cows, right? So they're Holsteins. That's where I come from. That's where they originate. It's a little glaciated area. So part of the last ice age, at least the landscapes experienced that. So I grew up with a lot of lakes around. I enjoy water. I enjoy the outdoors. I wanted to, at some point, be a marine biologist to be able to study critters in Arctic and Antarctic environments. But I quickly left that when I went to the university, which was in Kiel, just 100 kilometers away from where I grew up, and then focused on entomology and limnology and things like that. So because I could have aquaria and terraria in my little room that I had at home when I went to college, so I could watch those critters instead of needing a big trawler that would dredge up stuff from the seafloor or things. So I switched pretty quickly and have enjoyed that ever since. My interest in ecology and conservation comes from I don't know where it is, but my family is not necessarily involved in that. Was always interested in it. My mom always did organic gardening. So my grandfather used to manage a farm in Eastern Germany. So there's some background in that. So my initial idea was to do pest control using biological methods. And I spent a summer working for what was then called the International Institute of Biological Control in Switzerland. And they had something that they called biological control of weeds. So that was basically trying to use insects to reduce abundance and impacts of introduced plants. And at some point during some coffee break, my then advisor said, is anybody interested in trying to look at purple loosestrife and whether we can use biocontrol for purple loosestrife? It's an introduced species and it's invasive in the US. And I slowly raised my hand and said, let me take a look at that. So I spent a sleepless night thinking about the possibilities and said, oh, this may be something interesting, because I was looking for a master's thesis at that time as well. And so I spent a large part of my career really looking at insects and how they would affect plants. And I did that with funding from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and congressional support to trying to find critters that would be safe for introduction into the U.S. and then help control purple loosestrife. And so I did that for my master's and my PhD program. And in 1992, we got permission to bring these critters over to North America. And I came with them as a glorified caretaker initially, trying to just teach people, this is how you deal with insects. This is how you deal with these particular insects. because most people that I was working with were wildlife refuge managers, people interested in birds and wildlife, so the typical thing, not entomologists. So I tried to teach them a few things, and then I realized, oh, there's lots of opportunities, scientific opportunities, career advancement opportunities in the US. Cornell is not a bad place to be, right? As an ecologist, so I stuck it around. And believe it or not, what we will be talking about in a little bit, I said, North America, there's still some bears and wolves and other things around that make this like a wilder landscape that I may want to enjoy a little bit. And instead of sitting I had a postdoc lined up in London at Imperial College, and I said, nah, I'm not going to do that. I'm sticking around in North America and try to do that. So it's a long, convoluted answer, but it gets you to where I wanted to be. Came to the US as an entomologist. And part of my scientific career here then was, if we bring insects over, even though I was pretty sure that they would be very specific and not eat children or bananas or do other damaging things to US ecosystems, I wanted to also understand what actually will happen, because we wanted to control a particular plant introduced from Europe. Would the benefits that we were expecting, would there be detrimental impacts or other things? So I started looking at what introduced plants, not only purple loosestrife, but others, would do to native species in North America. So that involved then branching out from purple loosestrife, a wetland species, to other wetland species, and then also forest species that included a bunch of organisms. And as I was drilling down and trying to understand what's happening there, deer forced themselves onto my agenda, because there is no conservation in North America unless you do some reductions of the deer abundance, because they are one of the major destructive forces in at least eastern and midwestern North American forests and wetlands and grasslands. I never wanted to work with them directly, but I realized through data collections and others that if we don't do something about deer, we don't have a chance for conservation. We can't protect our orchids and trilliums. And this may not be what people know who listen to the podcast, but the charismatic spring wildflowers that we so enjoy in the spring in the forest, most of them would disappear. So would a lot of the trees that we enjoy, because the deer will just eat the little saplings once they get into browsing height. So that's where I arrived, where we're at today. That's how you found me, because of what I then said about big predators that may do something about deer populations or not.
Okay, so that's how you kind of made this transition from smaller critters to megafauna and large predators, is through the concept of deer management.
Yeah, that's really ultimate. You could, depending on where you are, trophic aids in the food chain, right? You could think about bringing herbivores to control a plant. That's also some restructuring of interactions, right? So I would call what we try to lay out in the paper that we will be talking about, how to restructure ecological relationships that are a little out of whack, if you just want to use that word, right? And so we thought, hey, we want to protect the plants, we want to protect the birds, we want to protect the amphibians, we want to protect the salamanders that call the forest home. And as we were looking into it more and more and more, what emerged to us was we can't do that without greatly reducing deer abundance. And so then the question is, how? How are you doing this, right? And so we looked a lot into that. That wasn't the focus of what we're talking about, the research today, but there are precursors to the things that we're talking about today. Yeah, that's how I arrived at it. Wasn't by choice. I'm not a wildlife biologist, but that's how I got there.
Yeah, it's fascinating because all three of us, I mean, you live in upstate New York now for the last 3 decades. Steve and I both come from the East Coast, Connecticut and New York, respectively. So we completely understand the deer angle.
Oh,
yeah.
How deer, to a degree, are an invasive species with no regulation in terms of either hunting or a natural predator to really keep them in check, to a sense. So this is why reading that article that was in the Cornell Chronicle was so fascinating to me. And we really love to get your opinion on it because, like you said, this is such a great journey to hear because you, like Stephen said, you started with small fauna and now everything, and it's all ecologically related. So I think it's beautiful that you're able to bring your expertise and what you studied for so long into a paper such as this. And
it's particularly fascinating in the way you did it because you've kind of run the gamut of species from small to megafauna, charismatic megafauna, whatever folks want to call them, large predators. So I feel like this is a very thorough understanding of trophic cascades. And so I'm excited to get into that.
For me, the fascination is with relationships. That doesn't exclude us, right? We're part of nature. We have a responsibility to what the environments that we look at and enjoy or not look like, right? A lot of it is human structures, even very far away. So I initially said I wanted to work in Antarctica and the Arctic. The influences of humans are everywhere, right? And this is not just the Polar Research Station, it's the pollution that gets there. So whatever we do somewhere, it doesn't stay put locally, it spreads. And so we have sorted our environments in ways. And part of what we did was eliminate a lot of the predators by thinking they are competitors. And I see that very different. We just need to form new relationships. Our understanding what our role is in these environments needs to help us on be better stewards of the environments. That's what we would like to do. And very often we have very simple truths, or we think these are truths, right? So we say, hey, something is killing something that needs to be able to then control populations. Cars kill a lot of deer, right? But nobody would say that cars would be able to control deer population.
Right.
But sometimes people think, I'm shooting a deer, so I'm contributing to deer control. Nope, no, you're not. Whether you're a car driver in a car or whether you're a hunter, that's not necessarily the case. So the subtleties, and that's part of our problem, very often go away because there's a lot of shouting that goes on with people that are convinced that they got it right. And sometimes you follow up and say, well, maybe there's a little kernel of truth here, but you definitely can't make those bold claims in the way that you have done that before. I'm thinking of an example that's very different than what we're talking about, but our fight against germs, if you want to think about that, right? Using antibiotics and cleaning products and all kinds of other things. And you see it on TV and commercials every single day. That backfires. We've done revenge effects, right? By us trying to be clean, we get rid of all the beneficial microbes that are there as well. And so predators have lots of beneficial effects by wiping out the predators because we think they're eating a deer that we want to shoot. Now we're seeing the forest being deteriorating and not being able to renew themselves. So we call that revenge effects. And these subtle interactions, or sometimes strong interactions, that's what fascinates me as an individual and a conservationist and a scientist.
Yeah, I'm interested to know what you think about the concept of, or at least the involvement of wolves very specifically within the idea of trophic cascades. Like, give listeners some kind of context of your approach on the subject in this way, which seems to be a topic of some amount of disagreement, right? Because some folks saying wolves make these massive changes instantly as soon as they're reintroduced onto any particular landscape, and they can be sort of credited for these massive comprehensive natural changes. And then some are saying it's just way too complicated a web of circumstances to give all that credit to any one species. Where do you kind of fall on that concept as it relates to wolves, or the evidence you've seen that swings you in one direction or another?
Yeah, so the piece that you're seeing now in the relative strengths that wolves can have or restructuring ecosystems by reducing deer abundance is a little evolution that happened to me in the last more like 3 years. I was always fascinated by this idea that you have a trophic cascade, big predators come into the system and they make things beautiful and pretty. And take a little bit of the responsibility that we have away from us, or maybe our great assistants. There's another piece that we are working on that tries to restructure the way that wildlife management is being done in the U.S. that talks about the constitutional arrangements. I don't want to necessarily touch that, but this is almost like a follow-up on that, because what we wrote there is we have evaluated hunting, we have evaluated sterilization, we have evaluated lots of other different processes on how we can manage deer in urban or rural environment, and nothing seems to work if we leave it the way that it is right now. So maybe big predators, wolves, grizzly bears, mountain lions could come to the help. And wolves were particularly important because of the stories that came out of Yellowstone, right? You are probably two of the people that have watched how wolves restore rivers or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Narrated by one of my favorite nature writer and others, Monbiot, right? It's a beautifully done story. It's very convincing. I wanted to believe it. And then I did a little ecological archaeology and started digging in what was really known, how evidence was collected. And the story didn't quite hold up in the way that it is made to be. There's a lot of wishful thinking on it, and a little bit of problematic data collection. So what people did there was go to places where there was some aspen regeneration in Yellowstone, measured some things, but it wasn't done in a statistically sophisticated way. So there are problems with that. And then sometimes you get hit on the head by circumstances, and that happened to me as well. So I'm going to explain that to you. I was fortunate enough to be given some money to look at how to change deer management and maybe predator management. And we said, we need to understand if there are questions about how strong the effect of wolves is on ungulates, whether these are elk or deer. Is the evidence really like a domino thing, right? Wolves come in, deer populations or elk populations are reduced, forests are doing better, all the critters are doing better. Do we have that? No, we don't. It's not really quite there. So we decided to work in northern Wisconsin where we have wolves. You know, there are no wolves in the east, right? One comes as a hello, but then it's being shot. But northern Wisconsin has wolves, and one of my former postdocs is the wolf and bear and elk biologist for the state of Wisconsin. So she is in northern Wisconsin. And because I have some funding to do that, I advertised for a postdoc position. So one of the applicants who was successful in the end is Elaine Bryce. She's now a postdoc in my lab. Her PhD was done exactly on what we have been talking about: wolves, elk, and aspen, the trophic cascade in Yellowstone National Park. So she did that for her PhD under supervision by Dan McNulty from Utah State. And she just published that as well. And what clearly shows, yes, wolves may have a contribution, but it's not necessarily the largest contribution. Hunters have had a big contribution in the elk numbers that went down through hunting efforts in Montana. They kind of stopped that, the winter shooting of elk on hunting grounds. But we don't understand what grizzlies are doing to the entire system, what mountain lions are doing to the entire system and elk decline, and what food availability does to the entire situation. So here I am, happy as a clam that she applied, having had that background, and then come and join my team. And she's running this Wisconsin project right now, where we just started doing our work there this spring. It was the first season, so we'll do that for 3 years and trying to understand whether not only effects on forest regeneration, but also on birds or amphibians. Be using acoustic monitors or recorders out there to trying to understand. We're working at 50 different locations across northern Wisconsin, and hopefully we'll have some more evidence. What we have seen by just traveling there and traversing northern Wisconsin, there's plenty of happy deer in wolf country. I've never seen as many deer along roadsides as there are where the wolves are there. So it's definitely not that the wolves are, eradicating deer, what you sometimes hear from the hunting public. We had the pleasure of visiting some of the tribal landscapes for some other things, and part of that was going to the Menominee what I said, we have much longer hunting season. Our deer populations are way lower than what is it on other lands. And I was asking, so you still getting your deer? And they look at me and laughing. Of course we are. I don't know whether they're better hunters or whatever they do. They said we have a longer hunting season. They hunt from September to the end of December. It's a subsistence hunt, right? It's not a trophy hunt. So there may be difference there. Their forests with the management that they're doing are beautiful, big old trees, wonderful forest understory. It's impressive. And then at the same time, we were switching to a different Airbnb just a few miles away, maybe 20, 30 miles away. We encountered a person mowing the lawn on a riding lawnmower, and we were unpacking our research equipment, and he came over and said, may I ask what you're doing? So that was a discussion that we then had. And as soon as he realized what we're doing, he said, oh, yeah, with all these wolves and the bears, and there are no more deer in the landscape. That's just impossible. We can't shoot any deer. So, you have the same landscapes, different management, and very different attitudes. So and they can't be both right? So what we saw in the woods was a heavy deer impact, regardless of whether you had wolves in the system or not. We will have more data to show. So, Stephen, you asked where I'm coming down on the structuring forces of wolves, right? The evidence that we have right now doesn't seem to suggest at current deer abundance that wolves would be a major factor in reducing them to something where we could say, we can walk away and the wolves doing the job for us. It's not possible. There are far too many deer at the present time in the woods. And wolves with the social structure of packs that kind of divide the landscape into territories or so, they will never build up huge populations that could take down the deer. The wolf eats about 20 deer a year. Most of them will be fawns and old ones. And there are far too many deer in wolf territory to be able to do that. Now, would I say that wolves have absolutely no impact? No, I wouldn't say that either. But maybe they have a more stabilizing effect once we reduce deer numbers down to something where some predation by wolves, some hunting pressure would actually allow wolves and deer and forest plants and trees and human and livestock to have a different coexistence, right? Where everybody can thrive. So I don't want to get rid of hunting. I would rather have hunters shoot more deer, but the wolves are not the competitors, right? They're helping us. We need to change the attitudes toward the big predators as well. So,
yeah, I think you answered my question because I was going to piggyback off of that and ask that because it seems as though you have this very down the middle approach with the research that you have. Is that we need to kind of work together, and that hunters need to understand that. Are you finding that wolves are changing maybe the eating patterns or the migration patterns of the deer, therefore making it a little bit more difficult for hunters to find the deer that they would have found maybe 20 or 30 years ago? And that's why they may see this effect as negative as opposed to maybe the ecosystem regulating itself? Is that something that you
like
found?
They're there, but they're behaving differently.
This is interesting, John, and Stephen, talking about that. So what we know from deer behavior is not necessarily about what the wolves are doing to them. What we know from deer behavior is when you have hunters in the woods, it takes the deer 2 or 3 days, then they got it sorted out. We know that from deer, we know it from elk. So elk respond also to whether you are a bow hunter or whether you're a gun hunter. They change their behavioral patterns. They may become night active. They travel mid-slope, like in Colorado and in other places. So people have figured that out. We're putting GPS collars on them. The big bucks that a lot of hunters want to pursue, you are in your tree stand, that big buck walks by your tree stand, but at night. They also shrink their activity patterns. So deer don't do, at least not in the east here, do the migration that a bunch of western deer would do up and down slope, elk go to wintering grounds. We don't see that in the east anymore because climate has changed so that deer don't need to do that anymore. So they do it like a little bit more on the order of a few miles or so, not the large migrations that elk would have. So seasonally, they may do a little bit. Wolves don't follow the migration, right? They're staying territorial, so they need to eat what's left there. So they don't seem to be affecting that. I'm sure that what people have done with elk more is because there is this idea of the landscape of fear that may be something that you are referring to, right? So deer could be afraid of wolves, so they change their behavior pattern. What people have figured out in Yellowstone is, yes, elk do that, and I'm sure deer will do that too. They're smart animals. They have learned to live in lots of places that we call home as well, right? So they're not dumb in the way that they're doing that. So they go to those places that are having really good food or good cover at the times that the wolves are sleeping. And so they're still using the same places. There's overlap, but there's temporal separation. So they can use the high quality food when the wolves are taking their siesta, and then they move away when the wolves are going to go and want to eat. So they do that. They may be a little more alert, but we don't have any evidence that the reduction in the damage that they do to vegetation is reduced when you have wolves in the system through behavioral change. So that hunters or wolves may change deer behavior, that they go and eat when the wolves are napping, is an interesting one, because I think I said earlier that we saw so many deer in the middle of the day next to the roads in Wisconsin. So it's possible that the deer that are typically there, the wonderful term is crepuscular, right? Means active, kind of at the transition from day to night or night to day. That's when the deer are most active. Wolves are hunting at night and during that time. So maybe the Wisconsin deer have figured out, hey, they're taking their siesta in the middle of the day, so I'm going to go and eat in the middle of the day, and then I'm hiding in the places when the wolves are active. I don't know. It's a possibility. But I don't see deer out in the middle of the day grazing along or browsing along the edge of the fields and in the edge of the woods the way that I've seen in wolf country. Interesting. Maybe somebody can figure it out. I wouldn't put it past the deer that they're not smart enough to do exactly that. Now, the hunters should see the deer though, right? Because they're out there. Maybe more hunters should hunt during the middle of the day than going out an hour before dark or, in the first 2 hours of daylight. I do not know that. But the Menominee are able to shoot them, right? So I don't know who's the smarter hunter. I do not know. I've heard a lot of stories where people say, hey, there's fewer deer in the landscape. And we see that here in areas where we do some aggressive hunting with overbait and others, so it's typically not allowed in municipalities, that people say we don't see the deer anymore. But we have cameras out at night at our feeding station. There are fewer deer there, but it's not like they're greatly reduced. They just change. So they don't need to be out there in the middle of the day in suburbia because there's more food for them. So they have shorter browsing periods. Or as the woods change, vegetation grows up, deer change where they're feeding. And so if you have a hunter that says, I have my favorite tree stand, I have been there for 20 years, and the first 10 years I always saw deer. And now the last 10 years, since the wolves are there, I don't see any deer anymore. Well, your forest has grown up. The understory has disappeared. Maybe you should change your tree stand location instead of blaming it on the wolves or something like that, right? I have a number of people in some of the hunting programs that I coordinate that always say, we need to hunt smarter, not necessarily harder or with more people. So there's something to be said about that.
So what are we really up against here in North America? How serious is this issue of deer population? Like, what can we expect in the future if all stays the same?
Oh boy.
Yeah.
I hope you are not forecasting the future. That would be a disaster. One of the problems is that these are very, very slow but accumulating changes. So when you think about conservation or deer impacts, you need to think in decades and centuries, not in years or months or something like that. And we as humans are always very impatient. We want to see effects immediately, right? So we change the party that's in government and everything is different. It's not working like that, right? We put out a tweet and everybody acts differently. No, doesn't work that way either. So there's a lot of resistance to change. And so we need think about what in 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now, our woods would be declining because the trees that we have are, some of them may be cut down because they reached 100, 150 years. Some of them may be even getting older, then they're losing their vitality and declining that way. And we have a total restructuring of our forests where only some of the trees that deer are not favoring as much would be there. That would include a lot of introduced plant species, would include a lot of introduced brush species and shrubs. Our wetlands would be devastated. A lot of our spring wildflowers would be no longer existing. A lot of orchids would disappear. The specialized pollinators and insects that are focused on that would disappear. So will there be a readjustment period? Of course. We may not like those woodlands then, right? Because they're no longer diverse. They no longer provide enjoyable experiences for us to go out there and see the wildflowers or enjoy the insects and the butterflies. There will be fewer deer, and the fewer deer will suffer from lack of nutrition. And so everybody will be worse off. So we may see a lot of extinctions. For me, deer are a currently worse problem than climate change. Climate change is an important driving force, right? So I'm not a denier of climate change. It's a very, very serious problem. So by no means, don't get me wrong on that one. But species have capabilities to deal with that. Through their evolutionary history, they have seen things change, right? And so what do? They migrate north or south, depending on whether it gets cooler or warmer. There's also very rapid evolutionary change that they can adapt. And then there's flexibility. Humans can live from the north to the South Pole, right? And in deserts and others, we have coping mechanisms. A lot of species have similar things. Not everybody is so tightly linked to a specific environment. Some species are, and they are typically rare, but a lot of other species are not. So they may have large ranges. But by reducing populations to very small, isolated fragments, we take the evolutionary potential away. They can't evolve change because they're so small, you can't do that. And then with deer being basically ubiquitous from southern Florida to somewhere in Canada, the dispersal of these organisms that may need to move further north, right? So we have species that are now maybe in the Carolinas that may need to get to New York or to Canada. But to do that, they need to get to places where they can germinate if it's plants. They need to germinate, they need to grow, they need to produce fruit, and then they need to go and do these a couple of meters a year or maybe dispersed by some birds or something else. They are unable to do that right now because there are no safe landing places for propagules because the deer would immediately eat them. They will not be able to reproduce. So that stepping stone concept, or corridors as it is sometimes called in conservation, where people and species may be needing to move up and down the mountains or north-south. Yukon to Yellowstone, right? You have probably heard of that concept, allows species to move north and south without interruptions. If you have too many elk or too many deer in the system, that's just not happening. So the future for those organisms to finding new safe places, it's greatly jeopardized. So that amplifies climate change impact to something that is impossible for these species to overcome. And deer are everywhere, right? And there may be little niches for climate refugees, species of plants or animals to find a new space a little further north or a little higher up the mountain, but the deer are already there. So it's no longer a safe place for them.
In your research and in your opinion, what do you think are some tactics that humans can try to adapt or try and help along to curb some of these things that are, it seems as though are almost inevitable if there is no change? So in your research, what were some things that you saw that helped? Is it allowing, I'll just put one example, is one allowing these apex predators, these bears, these lions and wolves to just do their thing and sort of be co-stewards as a hunter or whatever it may be, or are there other avenues that you see that could work in the future?
So I wanted to couple that a little bit, John, right? So I explained that there will be effects and we may need different husbandry practices, right? So whatever that is, there needs to be some research done. But I want to decouple the functional effect that wolves have, meaning that they can help us reduce deer impacts, from the right to exist wherever they have been in the past or wherever they want to go now. So I am a strong advocate for that. Let them return. Let the grizzlies return. Let the elk come back to the east. Let them go where they want to go, where there is food and whatever they can do. But the justification for that is basically just a conservation thing. Those places will be better off with wolves in the system, but not because they will be greatly reducing deer population. That may not necessarily be the case. They may help weed out some of the weak individuals, right? Maybe the ones that got hit by cars will be taken quicker than having a long road to where they die someplace. The ones that may suffer from chronic wasting disease or some other diseases that are running through wildlife populations, they may help with cleanup because they will be so much better in picking out those individuals that can't run as fast or can't see as well anymore. So there is a beneficial effect that, while it affects the individual maybe detrimentally, the overall species will be better off. But that's a different argument. So there are these roles that wolves can still play and may even play very effectively in our world. So but I want to decouple that from their function. So I see that as an potential important contribution. We just don't know about that yet.
Is there a predator that might be more effective at reducing populations were its population to expand? Or is the biggest difference in landscapes as it relates to overpopulated deer whether they have the full host of North American predators or they don't? Is that the major difference? Because they're all sort of working together, collaborating at this predation, or is there a specific animal that, if their population were just to be expanded, maybe let's use an East Coast state, for example, which may have some black bear and obviously has coyotes, but no other real formidable predators. What's going to lead to legitimate reduction? The full host, or are there specific animals over wolves that might accomplish this for us?
So the hope for predation to solve the problem when we go beyond Homo sapiens, I don't see it. Whether it's a single individual or a combination of all predators. And it's a question of abundance. There are too many deer. And it's a question of safe spaces. Now, in Europe, wolves are returning to places that we never thought that they would come back to. I stuck around in North America because I said it's a wilder place, there's wolves there. Now, every year, over 400 wolf pups are born in Germany. So when my parents started telling me, hey, we have wolf packs here, where I said, what am I doing in North America? I'm not going to see a wolf in New York, at least not packs. So there are too many guns and other problems in between the Michigan and Wisconsin populations and the Canadian populations in New York. I have some hopes that they would come if they were allowed to return and get protection. But North American landscapes, even though they are not as densely populated typically as Western European landscapes, I see a very, very problematic coexistence in suburbia, say New Jersey or Connecticut. I don't know where you grew up in Connecticut, Stephen, but everything close to New York, having mountain lions in that area, you probably have a difficult time finding the tolerance for that. And the same with the pack hunting wolf. Now, they may find places like coyotes have found safe places, 4,000 coyotes in New York, in Chicago. Where the hell are they? You don't see them running around,
right.
Next to the Sears Tower, but they're there. So they clean up the rats and the raccoons and others. And the wolves may have an impact on the mesopredators, right? So maybe less predation by raccoons and skunks and others on birds or so. that would need to be seen and evaluated. So that's all a possibility. There could be beneficial functions, but not in terms of reducing damage to forest and plants by deer or pigs or something like that. That's not going to happen. But then the role, because that goes back to where you're talking about, Stephen, is really on us. So, and I think John tried to get there. What can we do if the status quo was entirely unsatisfactory? And it would be, humans are very effective hunters, at least they can be. What we see is that there is always a number of individuals that do better than others. There's research showing out that 20% of the hunters shoot 80% of the deer. And some colleagues in my department have done work like that. I see it in a number of programs. So I coordinate a bunch of suburban bow hunting programs to trying to reduce deer abundance there. And I just need a few people that are dedicated. Very often these are retired folks because they don't have young kids at home. They don't have careers to establish and do things, but they can get out at 3 o'clock at night and see whether the deer are out there at the bait station and shoot a few. And they enjoy that and seeing the ecological impact. So it's up to us. The question then is, how can you encourage hunters to shoot more deer? That's an attitude shift because I don't know whether you hunt, but very often hunters would say, I can't shoot a small buck because that's going to be a 10-pointer or whatever, a huge monster 5 years from now. And most of them will never make it. So they have difficulties with that. They don't understand the link to food. Young bucks eat too, right? Take food away from the bigger bucks, and having a lot of does there will take away the food from bigger bucks if big antlers is something that you want to go for. But hunters don't understand that concept. It's really difficult. But for those that would like to participate, how do we incentivize them going out, even if their freezer is full, their neighbors' freezers are full, their friends' freezers are full. And so why would you be out there? At least you know what East Coast winters are, right? So I assume you're now sitting in California enjoying the green up on Christmas or something like that, while it's 10 degrees here. So why would people be out there if they've already shot 10 deer? And I think the only way to do that is by having monetary incentives. Management agencies and landowners have tried with saying, hey, it would be a good thing if you do that. You would help me out, or shoot a doe first and then are allowed to shoot a buck. A lot of other things are there that people have tried and basically none work because, people have other things to do, right? Or it's too cold, or they don't want to shoot females, and all kinds of other things. There's some interesting stories how the Swiss try to do that. The Swiss have alpine areas where it's not our white-tailed deer, but it's roe deer and basically the red deer of Europe, basically our elk. And they hammer forest regeneration in these alpine areas that protect their ski resorts. And so if you don't have forest regeneration there, the ski resorts are in danger of being wiped out by avalanches. So they allow recreational hunters to go in. They have a certain number of red deer that are being shot. And then if the numbers are not up to what the agencies have determined is necessary, then they have professional hunters go in and shoot the quota so that you get down to the numbers that are then sustainable. The big thing about that also is it allows the recreational hunters to have first crack at it. And so they can't complain that all the deer are being shot away from them. You can go and you can do first. If you're not successful, we have other people that do the cleanup after you. So that's very successful.
So it sounds like we have to restructure our relationship with recreational hunting to make it work for us as a real tool for conservation. And part of that sounds like maybe just simply taking more deer, but also maybe our relationship with it socially, like hunting solely bucks with big antlers, for example. Can you go into that a bit more? What are the downsides to this insatiable desire for big antlers that some hunters just seem to have? And even if they don't have it, they still trend in that direction just because it's tradition.
I don't know whether it's tradition, so I'm going to get into that one. It seems, and I don't see, it's almost like a chicken and an egg problem, right? So if you go and you look at hunting videos, you have those folks out there promoting big antlers. They're always shooting the big ones. They want to get into the record books. They do all kinds of things to manage food availability. Where it's legal, they do baiting, and then they pride themselves of shooting big bucks. So that's what the typical non-industry hunter that doesn't have a YouTube channel, although a lot of them have now, are going after. Those are the examples, right? So those are the peers that people that come into hunting strive for. Traditionally, hunting was more of a subsistence thing. A lot of rural folks getting together, getting out, having a good time, going out in the woods, doing some deer drives. And you look at the antlers that they were shooting at the vast majority, these were small ones, and that was okay. So that affection and focus on big antlers is really something that is more recent. And it may be driven by the industry and the folks that are the well-known names in the hunting industry. I do not know. I have my strong suspicion that that's the case.
Yeah, I'd agree.
So here in New York, there are some organizations that push for antler restrictions. So you can only shoot deer that have a certain number of antler points. So that is the idea. Let the young ones go so they become big. And it's typically being fought by most recreational hunters because they don't want to do that. It's certain folks that are very often associated with hunting organizations. They think that's what they want to do. But it's not a majority opinion. When you ask hunters or the general public, what's most accepted is, and the vast majority will accept hunting, 70% of the population accept hunting, but the justification for hunting is food for yourself, food for your neighbors, donation to food banks, all these things where you utilize the things, not necessarily head on the wall. That shouldn't be your focus. That's the least accepted in the general population. And it's the least accepted for most hunters. So how do we get to that recalibration? I'm not entirely sure what it is. There are some people in the industry that start thinking differently. They start thinking about health of forests. We see that. But what has largely been missing is this link, hunters as conservationists, right? That has been there for a very, very long time. Some hunting magazines are say, well, what is the Elk Foundation? Hunting is conservation, or hunters are conservationists. And to some extent, that's true because they have been conserving species that should be hunted or can be hunted, right? Ducks and waterfowl is a good success story because they have built habitats for them and they have regulated how many have been shot. So that worked fine if hunting is the biggest threat to population. But even in the waterfowl arena, the high abundance of Canada geese or snow geese that are beyond the bounds what habitats can support in the Arctic or here, hunting doesn't affect that. You can basically shoot as many geese as you want for the urban dwelling geese or the snow geese, and hunters are not reducing the numbers. So that doesn't work. Once the populations are too large, recreational hunting is not effective. So you need to get to the incentives. But a big thing that we also see is people want to know when you should stop. When do you know that you've shot enough animals that forests can recover and birds can recover and other things? So where management agencies and others have fallen short is come up with I would call them currencies or metrics or indicators that say, hey, our habitat now is in good enough condition. We don't need to shoot 70% or 80% of the deer. We can do it a little less than that. And so part of what I have worked on is trying to develop what we call indicators. quick assessment methods that are sensitive to how deer abundance change, and not only deer abundance, but also how that translates into deer impacts. So that's an important aspect for it. So you're not run into all the hunters and said, oh, you're killing all the deer, there's nothing left, and the forests are doing fine because we have trees. There's more to be said to that.
Right. I want to ask you something, I guess more on a personal level, which I think goes with your myths portion of your paper, because you said a few minutes back about how wolves, I'm just taking it back to wolves for a second, is that their recovery in Europe is almost astounding. I mean, 400 pups born in Germany in a year is outstanding. So where do you think the disconnect is in North America for, I mean, I'm sure there are reasons with, political legislation, things of that sort. Why are wolves able to come back in Europe at a more of a freer pace as opposed to here in North America where everything is legislated, be it land, management of prey, et cetera, et cetera?
I wish I would have a real simple answer. I have some gut feelings about that, right? But part of it is laws and the lack of, I don't know how many guns are in every household if you average it in North America. I do not know that, but it's more than one. Yeah. So that means that as a wolf steps out of an established territory, the chances for that wolf to be shot are high because hunters and the availability of guns limit the ability of wolves to thrive in many states outside their current established distribution. That's not the only reason, but wolves are fully protected endangered species, right, in many places. I'm going to switch because my wife just came back home, so I'm going to go to a different location to have it quieter. So that's one thing. And so the other thing that happens in Europe is you don't have coyotes there. So by not having coyotes in Europe, there is no excuse for a hunter to pull the trigger and say, oops, I shot a coyote, because you cannot confuse them, right? So here, although I have to say, I don't think you can confuse a coyote with a wolf, maybe a wolf pup or something like that. But a lot of people that shoot wolves as they are dispersing, if they say, oops, that was an accident, they justify it by saying, oh, I've confused it with a coyote. So hence the argument that we have, if you want to allow the wolves to return, you need to also protect coyotes. But there is almost not quite as vehement a hate on coyotes as there is on wolves. So there's an attitude shift that needs to happen, but it also is a legislative thing, and it's for the entire European Union, right? So the EU has said wolves have an existence right throughout the European Union. You hunters, you are complaining about that wolves are eating deer or so. You do not own the deer. You only own the deer once you shoot it and put a tag on it, right? So only then do you own it. So you haven't lost anything. And so that's the attitude that comes from the Ministry of Environment or whatever they are. Now, that is not conflict-free. Sheep herders in France and in Spain, they complain about wolf predation, yes. Hunters even in Switzerland complain about lynx recolonizing areas and predating on roe deer. In Scandinavia, the reindeer herders are upset about wolf predation. So it's not conflict-free, but in general, it's much less so. I follow the situation in Germany more because that's where I grew up. And so there, it's very clear that people do things proactive, saying wolves are coming back, they will be establishing territories here. Here are the things that you need to do. And government subsidizes different husbandry practices, right? So you need to increase your fences around your property. And it's very clear, once you have a 4-foot fence, wolves are not going to jump over it. I think it's 1.20 meters, so that should be like 4 feet. And then if there is wolf predation on livestock within the fences or so, you have an inspector come and assess what your fence structure actually is. And if you have a breach in there, you haven't maintained a fence in a way that a wolf can easily go through that, you're not going to get compensated for wolf damage or so. So it's at the there is support from the government for individual losses, but you also have a responsibility to do the right thing. And if you don't do the right thing and you kind of goof off or you don't take your responsibilities seriously, then you're not going to get financial compensation for that. So the landscape is very different, right? Gun culture is very different. And the hate of wolves is very different. I never encounter as much hate about wolves as I've seen here in Germany. Now, I haven't lived there for 30 years, and so I don't know what it is. There are heated public meetings when wolves first come in. And so I follow some of the stories on YouTube or others, long documentaries, to see what is actually happening. It's interesting for me, having grown up in Germany, but also professionally, trying to link it to the situation here. And so you get this uproar, wolves are coming in, our children are in danger because you see a wolf somewhere. And then that dies down within 2-3 years after wolves come back, establish territories, because they know where they are. But they're not seen. People go and hunt mushrooms and go hunting. What you need to be a little bit more careful about is driven hunts. That's what people are reporting. Once the wolves are back in the system, driven hunts are very often for pigs in Germany, right? And so they use dogs. And so the dogs are driving the pigs through the landscape. And then you go to, you have beaters too that go through the landscape, but it's a lot of dogs that drive the pigs around. And you get to a line of shooters. Now, those pigs that have encountered wolves, they behave towards dogs differently and more defensively than just running away, because that's not a chance for wolves. So they do that. But the German hunters train their dogs differently now, and they have vets on when they have driven hunts, because very often these are little cuts that the big boars do when or they bite a dog. If you have immediate care there, all the dogs are surviving. Well, maybe not all the dogs, but so there's a threat to the hunting dogs, right? Because the pigs, the wild boar, have learned to deal with wolves that are in the system. But the German hunters, they adapted to that and say, well, it's fine now. So, yeah.
It just seems such a 180 from, I'm sure, stories that you heard when you were growing up, and specifically, I think of like the little Red Riding Hoods and the wolves extirpated from the landscape in Europe. It's just fascinating that this turn of events has happened where wolves are coming back at an alarming rate, and the acceptance, while not 100%, eventually seems to be getting there. And a lot of the stories and the myths and things that we've heard in North America have come from that place. And it's just interesting to see how there's an adaptation happening in Europe across, like you say, Germany, Switzerland, Italy, Spain.
They are through Western Europe now, John.
Through Western Europe, yeah.
It's Denmark, Netherlands, Belgium, France, Spain. They have always had remnant populations in Italy. They're basically out throughout the continent. They always had strongholds in Eastern Europe. And I would not want to use your word alarming. For me, it's not alarming that the wolves come back. It's astounding.
Astounding, yeah. That's
Astounding, fascinating, because we never thought they would come back and live in densely populated areas. Because for us, both in Europe and in North America, woods were the creatures of the deep woods and where no humans are. And they're showing you very different right now. So if you leave them alone, they can make a living where they have food. So that's what's happening right now. How far that will go, I have a difficult time seeing then, in Westchester County outside of New York City or so much of New Jersey and Connecticut. However, when you think about where black bears are, they're all over New Jersey and Connecticut, right? How do they make a living in those places? And so if you keep, take care of your trash and adapt to that, if you go hiking, not just in New Jersey or Connecticut, your food goes up the tree or it's in a bear-proof canister, right? We have ways of adapting to the presence of these critters. And it's also in Germany and here, wolves and bears become dangerous when you start feeding them and they get used to people. It's the same with coyotes, right? Keeping dog food out on the deck, or cat food. Hey, it's not just your cat eating it, it's the skunk, it's the coyotes, it's the raccoons. And so while it may be charming to think about wildlife, bird feeders, and food out there, you create habituated animals that then can become dangerous to yourself or others.
Right. Yeah. And thank you for the correction. Yeah. I meant alarming in a good way, but I appreciate you saying astounding and amazing, because it is amazing to me to hear that stuff. But I agree with you. It is incredible that you're working here in the States to try and restore really these ecological places, these forests, the trees, everything, basically from the ground up. And it's just amazing to me on the other side of the pond that Europe seems to be allowing these things to happen even in the more urban centers. So it's just fascinating for me to see that, especially from someone who has firsthand experience living both in Europe and now here in North America. So the last thing I want to sort of touch on, I don't know if we've gotten into a little bit, the accountability in predator conservation and management was this part of the paper that you were going in? Is it the same old song and dance with legislation and politics and laws and things like that? Or are there other factors that contributed to us being accountable? I assume it's humans being accountable to the conservation and management in that vein.
So, as always, once it comes to relationships, they're complex and fraught with history and assumptions and things, half-truths and others. So there's truth to that it's a political game and special interests. And so the special interests may be both on the side of folks that say, hey, you bring wolves back, all our deer disappear, and we can't keep sheep and cattle anymore. And so wherever those stories are coming from, there's not that much truth to it, at least not across the landscape. Although we have had stories of individual packs or maybe even individuals that get habituated to being able to just take down the sheep that are not well protected or maybe become specialized in that. So there will likely be problematic animals on an individual basis that maybe need to be taken care of, either through translocation. We have that with bears, right? You can do that. That may not be a good idea for wolves because of their social structure. Maybe we need to remove wolves that become problem animals, right? So that means killing them. I have no problem with that if there is misbehavior on the wolf side, right? So call it that way. They need to live with us. We need to live with them, find a new way of coexisting. And if you constantly break the rules, there are consequences for that. Unfortunately, right? The vast majority of the individuals will be just fine. So that's okay. But so then there's policy captures. It's the story in Wisconsin or around Yellowstone that we hear about the mass slaughter of wolves that get out of Yellowstone and trying to make a living just outside the park. It's very disheartening to see that, right? So why? There's no reason, no ecological reason, no competitive reason in terms of there are fewer elk or so. It's just all hearsay. The data are not there. But politicians and very often management agencies that are focused on catering towards hunters follow suit with that without having a good data set with that. So there's a problem there, right? So if you say wolves are a problem, show me the evidence that they are, give me the numbers, and give me the numbers in proportion to what's killed by bad weather or bad husbandry practices or disease, right? Yes, wolves may kill a cow or a calf or sheep, but how many calves or sheep are you losing by bad weather or diseases or something? Maybe wolves are contributing to 5% of the losses or 10% of the losses or 80% of the losses. The way that we would need to deal with that is very different, right? So, but that's not typically disclosed, very difficult to get to. So that's part of the accountability. The same goes with When you would get wolves in the system, are they taking down all the deer? No, we know that already, but we would like to have the data for that, right? And so it's part of the management agency's responsibility to assess what deer are doing to our forests, not just how many are shot by hunters, but what wolves are doing to deer populations and the well-being of the forest. So it has to be an entire network of responsibilities, change in attitudes that based on information, not just hearsay. And how are you going to get to that? If you have a golden compass or a wonderful globe that you can look into the future for and tell me this is the thing to do, please do so. But I think this podcast, us talking to our friends and other things that you do of reshaping relationships and doing this one individual at a time, and particularly working with young kids that maybe not have a well-established attitude, but are learning and willing to listen. That's my hope. That's why I'm in education, So maybe that's why you are in communication. So there's always something to be said about being open to new ideas and listen to evidence. That's what I like to see.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll admit it's hard to accept sometimes just how difficult it can be to really land on the truth, to find the God's honest truth about something, because there is so much information out there, and it seems like a massive effort for us just to get on the same page about something without twisting it. And it sounds like what you might be touching on is that this is one of the issues here, is just simply getting on the same page and just knowing and speaking the truth without putting a spin on it.
So I don't know whether all the people that are involved in that want to spin it, right? So I get the point that some people that have whatever the vested interest is, whether they want to influence, whether they want to have likes, whether they want to have whatever. There's all kinds of ways, right, of how people try to do that. But they also have learned or dislearned the ability to use good filters to get to that. And it becomes increasingly difficult because everybody immediately has access to your computer and your screen if they find you through your webpage, through your podcast, through your YouTube video or whatever. And then distinguishing what is maybe slightly misleading or it's misinformed or purposeful misleading to get to a certain point, I don't know. I totally disagree with you that finding appropriate information that's vetted and so you can trust that has become increasingly difficult. And it's part of search algorithms that want to just rile you up, Twitter fights, whatever it is, that live on the fight and not on the truthful exchange of information, if that's even available. It's not always available, right? And so I don't live in social media because I do things that are potentially controversial, right? Not potential, they are controversial. You know that very well, right? So putting the title of Wolf and Myth together in one sentence creates a lot of interest with people that read beyond the headline. So okay, that's good. So it wasn't necessarily a marketing idea for that, but we all try to have people take more than just the first look at that. But I don't, as I said, I don't work in social media because it would deteriorate into shouting matches that don't have any substance for me. And so I try to work differently. The suburban deer management, when people write in online magazines, or there are still some printed newspapers out there, right, that then on the online versions have comment sections. It basically takes you to comment 2 or 3, where all the hunters are being called murderers and deer don't have an impact. So the deterioration of a discussion by whether these people are purposeful trolls or whether these are their honest opinions about it doesn't matter. It deteriorates immediately into a shouting match. And I have very little patience and time for that, I have to say.
I can't agree with you more on that. And this has been really an eye-opening and fascinating discussion, Bernd. And those of you that are listening to this, I'm going to have we will have the article that was in the Cornell Chronicle in the description. We're also going to have Bernd's paper in there as well, so you guys can take a look at it and get through and really get in depth to more of what we were discussing today. My last thing for you, Bernd, Stephen may have something after this, is when you hear the word wolf, what is the thing that comes to your mind?
I'm going to just throw a couple of words at you, right? So one is wild, untamed, charismatic, and representing something that we have lost, right? It's a keystone species in that there is something untamed about wolves and the way that they're trying to make a living with their social structure that's so fascinating. And maybe there is so much disdain for wolves because they are not caught up in all our domestic fights, right? They're living their independent lives out there. Maybe some of the people that want to shoot them are jealous of the independence that they have. I don't know that. It's something. And then the last thing that I would say, I would love to have them see outside my window. When I get up in the morning, I would like to look up on the landscape, and maybe occasionally I have a chance of seeing a gray wolf run across the meadow, right? Occasionally I see a bear. Very occasionally I see a bobcat come through. I would love to have a wolf just stroll through our woods. That would be a dream for me. So that's my association when I hear the word wolf.
Wow. I love that so much. So I know you're not on social media. If anyone wants to connect, is there any way through Cornell that they can reach you if they have any questions about your research, things of that sort?
So I don't know what you are linking in your podcast. You said you're going to have it on your web. There's some descriptors. I think people can find me via email. I have a couple of web pages that are being revamped right now, but I don't necessarily answer questions that come through web pages. There's a web page that's in preparation. It's called Dear Impact. So that will be launching at some point, but I don't want to have just a rudimentary thing. I'm pretty good at answering emails. It may take me a moment to get to that, but that's pretty good. I will not respond to things that are just, annoying, hard-hitting things and someone, you're an idiot. Don't expect an email back if somebody tells me I'm totally wrong. But I will, thoughtful pieces, interesting questions, I will try to answer.
You'll have all the information in the description, everyone who's listening. Again, Bernd Blossey, thank you so much for joining Stephen and I. This was fascinating. And just keep doing what you're doing. It was a pleasure, and you're an incredible individual. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. This was very enjoyable. Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. How's to all of you out there, and Stephen, I'll be with you next time. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Looking to support Wolf Connection or sponsor one of the wolves in our pack? Just go to wolfconnection.org, click on the Donate tab, and find out more information.